Good morning or afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the online Geneva Trade and Development Workshop. This is a series jointly organized by CEPR, the Geneva School of Economics and Management, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, UNCTAD, and the WTO. My name is Cedric T. I'm a professor of economics at the Graduate Institute. And for today's seminar, I'm very happy to welcome Şebnem Kalemli-Özkan from the University of Maryland, who will be presenting a recent work on the economic case for global vaccinations. Joint work with Cem Akmalki, Selva Demiralp, Sevkan Yeşiltaş, and Mohamed Yildirim. Just a few reminders on logistics before we start. The presentation will last about an hour and will be followed by 15 minutes for question and answers. During the presentation, feel free to ask your questions through the question and answer window that you have at the bottom of your screen, and the host will pass them on to Şebnem. For the final 15 minutes of open Q&A, participants can use the raise hand button to ask the questions directly to the speaker. So without further ado, thanks a lot, Şebnem, for taking the time to present your research. It's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by sharing my screen. And this is the full view. Okay, so yes, please interrupt anytime with questions. Let me start. So this is joint work with Cem Çakmaklı, Selva Demiralp, Sevkan Yeşiltaş, and Mohamed Yildirim, all at Koç University. Mohamed currently at Harvard. And the paper is about making the economic case for global vaccinations. Just to give you a bit of background in terms of timeline, we wrote this paper in January 2021. In fact, it was released at the press conference of WHO with Dr. Tedros on January 26, 2021. And then the idea at that time is let's show what happens economically when US and Europe only vaccinate themselves and not the rest of the world in terms of, again, economics, right? Not ethics, not morals. Obviously, that's very important. But you can see that still we are talking about that today, about the donations. The headlines today in terms of US donation is about morals and ethics. So, which is, of course, we all agree, and there's no question there. But we really want to make the case that the economic cost of this can also be huge for advanced economies. So it is in their best interest, actually, to achieve an equitable global vaccine distribution. So our starting point to make this case is, of course, COVID is a global crisis. We have to realize that COVID is a global crisis. It costs lives and livelihoods across the globe. So there is no country being spared here. This is an important observation now, clear to everyone. But even at the time when we were writing this, January 2021, in 2020, this wasn't clear, right? I mean, there were a lot of coverage about African countries being spared, and maybe emerging markets are not going to hit that bad. So we are at the point now that, of course, this is not the case, and we kind of made this observation early on. This observation comes with vaccines being a game changer and obviously can, stop the pandemic in a given country. And here the point we want to make is like, okay, if we are saying this is a global crisis, no country is spared, there has to be also the case, given the interconnections between countries, for the vaccines to be global, right? So the idea here is that even a country achieves universal vaccination of its citizens, that country may still suffer economically if the rest of the world is not vaccinated. And this paper is about estimating these costs, right? It is an academic paper at the end of the day, and it is going to give you lower and upper bound estimates. So these economic costs, of course, can be small, but they can also be very large, right? So, and that's what we want to do. What is the economic impact of not vaccinating poorer nations on rich nations? And how much of these global costs rich nations are going to bear, even they achieve universal inoculations in their own countries. And we will have a very detailed sectoral approach to understand which sectors in which economies are going to be especially vulnerable to such a scenario. So our framework is going to be extremely data-driven. And that is because we want tractability and maps a very simple model. We are going to have a simple model because we would like to bring the health shock completely to the forefront using an epidemiological model, but we want it also to be easily mapped with data. So we are going to do everything in the very short run with fixed prices. We are going to do this weekly estimation. So the idea is start in January 2021 and assume an unequal distribution of vaccines across the globe and do a weekly estimation and come till the end of the year. So in that sense, we are going to have everything based on fixed prices in the short run, demand determined output with labor supply constraint. Obviously, prices adjusting is going to give you a different picture, which we are now started to see with higher inflation and so forth, but we are not going to look into that in this paper. We will take IO network very seriously. So that is going to give us a lot of implications through possible nonlinearities, and that insight is going to come from a recent theoretical literature. I will be very clear on this in a moment. And the caveat is that I said there is not going to be a price adjustment. There's also not going to be a labor adjustment. So when there's a labor supply shock because workers are sick and cannot go to work, we are going to keep in there. So we will have this epidemiological parameters where you are sick for 2 weeks and then you go back to work. So things are going to be smoothed out to a certain extent, but we won't allow, countries or sectors start hiring from other sectors or start sourcing inputs from other countries and all that. We will have those scenarios too, but for the benchmark, we won't do that. So we want to understand how high the cost of not vaccinating Brazil for US can be. Okay, so that's the argument, the paper here. And if we start doing this type of adjustments, of course, data requirement is going to be much greater for our short-run estimation. That's why we don't do it. If I can show you a figure just to summarize what we do, it will be this simple figure in this slide. So the idea is to get at the heterogeneity of the COVID shock, which we know COVID is a shock that hits different sectors differently. So the idea is to get at that and map it to trade and production network globally. Okay, so this figure is drawn for one country here. So take a country, Switzerland, and then start with COVID-19. So the top part of the figure is going to think about the demand side, and the bottom part is going to think about the supply side. So for the top part, in fact, we have an early paper we did very early on, May 2020, just focusing on the demand side and emerging markets. So the idea here is like on the top is like, okay, there are all these infections, your consumption preferences are going to be altered. This is the standard. You are fearful of going to restaurants channel. So you are just fearful, so you don't consume, okay? So the idea here is, this has been done a lot now in the literature, but most of the literature focus on the domestic demand. So we bring the foreign demand, and then that's going to give you something about foreign infection rate affecting demand for your exports, right? So that's the top part, which is going to feed into equilibrium output. The bottom part is going to be the supply side of the COVID shock. COVID is a supply and demand shock, varying across sectors. So here we are going to bring that in by having an epidemiological model, a SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered model, at the sector level. Okay, so I will tell you how we do that, but instead of using these only at the country, like our numbers and infection rates at the country, we will start with that. We are going to use data given out by WHO and Johns Hopkins, but we are going to create a sectoral version of that by few assumptions, actually, with very straightforward data requirements. So we are going to say, look, every sector is going to have workers, some can telework and some has to be on site. And that's going to depend on the infection rate and also the sectors and the jobs, occupational characteristics. But obviously on site is going to having a higher infection rate if that sector is a sector that requires higher physical proximity for that job. That's going to give you the labor supply shock that is coming from both sides, on-site workers and teleworkable workers. And we are going to feed into foreign-based intermediate input shock, which is going to be based on foreign supply shocks, right? Foreign labor supply shock. In a foreign country, when the same labor supply shock happens, those inputs coming from the foreign country to you for your domestic production will also be delayed. That's the standard supply bottleneck story. And that's going to be feeding into supply, and both is going to give you the output. Okay, so that's how we are going to have a determination of sectoral output for every country. And here, what is important is that not only, as I said, we are going to have this full heterogeneity, worker and sector heterogeneity based on data telling us teleworkability and physical proximity of that sector. We are also going to combine it with using the global trade and production network data with important intermediate inputs. So here's a critical assumption we do is assuming loyalty of production function. Okay, so we are going to assume very strong complementarity. That is going to be based on the insight coming from the new theoretical literature, very inspiring work of David Bakke and late Emmanuel Fahri. So we basically carry their stuff to an empirical setup, okay? They base their theory on the evidence of strong complementarity in the short run. Papers such as Borne et al. Use Japanese earthquake and give us very low short-term elasticities, both production substitution and trade elasticities being very low in the short term. So we will basically rely on that literature and use those type of numbers. So that's the supply side. On the demand side, as I said, these CEPR model automatically gives you the fear factor coming not only for your domestic infection, but also foreign, right? If foreigners are fearful about consuming for whatever reason, say their infection rate is high, that's going to affect your exports. So we are going to feed that directly to your exports. And the way we do this infection dynamics, so this is going to be the key dynamic thing that is evolving in the paper starting in January 2021. And then you run this exercise for the whole year. That's going to be country and sector specific, where we are going to have this endogenous lockdowns, right? Which is going to make the supply shock even worse because you can be sick and not go to work. And then there can also be an endogenous lockdown depending on the ICU capacity in the country. If there are so many cases that passes the ICU capacity, then the country puts an endogenous lockdown. That's going to make the labor supply shock even worse. Okay, so that's what we are going to have based on the data. And here, this is just going to come from the ICU capacity. So when we dynamically evolve this epidemiological model, once your infections are so high, then we are going to introduce a lockdown. And then the normalization of demand is also going to depend on active cases, depending on that case, those case numbers being less than population divided by 20,000. This again comes everything observed in the data in 2020. And the open economy is basically feed into these infection dynamics to each country through the exports and imports and the global trade and production network. Okay, and that's a picture of that network and how we do this. I mean, the real picture is way more complicated with way more arrows, but then you cannot see that. So I'm going to show you here the strongest linkages. So this plot is basically going to be based on input-output trade that is more than 10% of GDP. So that's going to give you the arrows, and if it is even higher, that's going to give you the thickness of the arrows between countries. So left-hand side is countries. The size of the countries are going to be given with the box. Color coding is the openness, right? So Korea is a much more open country than the US. So that's going to give you the how high the trade is for that country, how important. And then the borders around these boxes are going to give you the vaccination status. So the exercise is about arguing that rich countries are going to achieve this universal vaccination immediately. Of course, this didn't happen, but let's say we assume that. So rich countries like US, Japan, Australia, these are all countries with boxes around them. They achieve universal vaccinations, and emerging markets and developing countries, India, Colombia, Peru, they don't achieve that. We have a box around China because we assume also China is fully vaccinated. And then inside that country trade and production linkages figure, we embed this sector one on the right. Okay, that is shown again with color codes where red sectors are going to be super open, super tradable sectors like computer, electricity. Pinkish sectors are more closed, construction, mining. The size is the size of the sector. The arrows are going to give you the directions of the input-output linkages. But the point here is not about the tradability of the sector. Okay, wholesale, retail, construction, mining, they may not be that tradable sectors as coke and petroleum products, but it doesn't matter as long as they are linked that much to the rest of the economy. And that's going to be a key result of the paper, as long as Brazil is not vaccinated and you input some sectors, input some resources from there in the US and other sectors connect to that, say wholesale retail, that sector is going to be hurt in the US. Okay, so that's going to be the key intuition in the paper. And of course, I don't have to tell this in this crowd, but you know that these are the OECD ICIO tables. And here we are plotting 65 countries, 35 industries. But of course, this is the entire world, as the smaller sectors and countries are going to be in this rest of the world category. So this is the entire global trade and production network data. Okay. So how are we going to bring the epidemiology here? Very simple epidemiological SIR model. So that's used now in many papers. So there's nothing new here, except we are going to make it sector. Okay, so let me go through the basics, how this is going to be done sectoral. So these models are known as susceptible, infected, recovered models, because those are basically the data that you collect and feed into the model, as given by the change in the susceptible people, change in the recovered people, and change in the infected people. And N is the population, and the beta and gamma are the parameters governing the pandemic. And this famous R number is basically beta over gamma. And the color code on the slide, the orange, is what is coming from the data. Okay, so we will get this data directly from WHO, Johns Hopkins, and all these sources as given for every country, and constantly updated. Now, to be able to turn this into a sector, right, from a country level model to a sector model, we are going to have some exceptions. So we are going to say, okay, there are case sectors in every economy, and there's of course a non-working population, old people, unemployed, and children. So every industry I is going to have LI workers, some is going to be teleworkable, TWI, some needs to be on-site, and I. So these, again, orange, we are going to read from data. We know the labor in each industry. We know the teleworkable share in each industry. That's going to give us the on-site workers. Then at any given time, number of staying at home is going to be given by this N naught with subscript 0. And that's going to be, of course, sum of the non-working population plus the teleworkable workers in each industry. Then we say, okay, how can I get at a sectoral infection rate from a country level rate? And I want to figure out these at-home groups infection rate. So I'm going to use data called prox-I. So that's going to be data that gives me the proximity requirement in each sector I. And by using that data, proximity requirement for each sector and the population N and country level infection rate beta, I can pull out beta naught, which is at-home groups infection rate. And that at-home groups infection rate interacted with each sector proximity is going to give me the sector level infection rate, beta. Okay? And what is that data? Let me show you so that you wouldn't think that, oh, but isn't this the same thing? If I'm a university professor, I am teleworkable, so my teleworkable share high, but my proximity share also high. So that's going to be the case in certain sectors and not other sectors. For example, if you look at the first two bars here, pink and gray, that's agriculture and fishing. Of course, that's a sector where you don't need proximity. So proximity requirement is low. And teleworkable also, you cannot do agriculture and fishing by teleworking. You can catch fishes clearly over email. So that's also, okay? So there are going to be sectors that these are positively correlated, but there are also going to be sectors such as construction, where they are completely different, right? Proximity requirement is very high. You have to basically working together, and teleworkable share is going to be very low. Okay, so that's the data we are going to use basically to get at those sectoral infection rates. And once we have that data, then of course we are just going to do all those equations that I showed you for the susceptible, infected, and recovered individuals for every sector. Okay. For every sector, I'm going to run these equations and the dynamics given with these equations on the slide. So that's basically actually like running a macro VAR. You are doing it at the sector level. Okay, so you are doing this evolution of infections in the extended multi-sector SIR instead of like one country SIR. Now I have a multi-sector SIR, and that's very much like a macro VAR is at the sector level. Okay, so that's going to be the change in the infections. And that's the dynamic of the disease that we feed into. So that's going to be the main thing changing dynamically in the model. Okay. Then we combine this with production. Okay. And the key here, as I said, this moving away from Cobb Douglas. Now, the theoretical literature took a long time to do this. And we all know why, because it is impossible to solve things once you move away from Cobb-Douglas. But we do know now from the empirical literature, Cobb-Douglas breaks down in the short run. It is very difficult to substitute among inputs. Forget the global, even in a country, in a domestic economy, among different suppliers. Okay, and that's exactly why we have this problem now in the global economy. And if you recall, in January, when we wrote this paper, actually, we thought, well, our estimation is probably going to be relevant for the 6 months. You don't expect these supply bottlenecks to be solved in 6 months. But the narrative then in January, February, this is like literally the first half of the year. Many policymakers and economists thought that way. The global value chain people didn't think so. Actually, if you were reading the interviews done by CEOs of big shipping companies like Marks and all, they all said this is going to last till October 2021. And now we are almost October 2021 and we still deal with this issue. We are still dealing with the supply bottleneck issue. So we want to bring that in full force in the empirical setup, okay? We need to understand after a year with the price adjustment, now with adjustment in the global value chains, this is going to change. But our point is like, let us focus on this short-run cost where we know Cobb-Douglas is not going to work. We are going to go to a Leontief. So that minimum production function will give us a Leontief. And that is fully in line in the 66 sector input-output model of Baki-Farhi with an elasticity of substitution among inputs that is zero, basically. And if you look at the calibrated version of the Baki-Farhi model, they assume a 0.01 elasticity because obviously you cannot solve with zero. That's going to crash. They solve it with, they calibrate with 0.01. And those estimates come from papers like Atalay for the domestic US economy, Borne et al. Paper also bringing us the both production and trade elasticities using Japanese earthquake as the shock. Now, we have even actually lesser sectors than Baki-Farhi, right? They have more detailed 66 sector. We are, because they only do US, we are doing the global network, so that's 35 sectors. So in that sense, our complementarity assumptions, very strong complementarity is even more justified on a 35 sector, right? Because 66 sector is like, you're saying, I mean, so that's much detailed level, right? So you are saying maybe the certain type of wood are complements, where we are saying in a 35 sector thing, wood and electricity is a complement. So it's more realistic in a 35 sector environment, allowing nonlinearities and substitution within narrow 4 6-digit sectors. Okay. All right. Oops. Sorry. So that's going to be the production function for country C, industry I. Inputs are coming from industry J. It can be from the same country or imported internationally. And labor is coming obviously from the same country domestic. Okay. Now, during the pandemic, so how is the pandemic changing? So everything is one-time shock, right? Everything is hat algebra before and after the pandemic. Primes are going to denote during the pandemic, and hat notation, hat algebra is going to be the ratio of during the pandemic divided by before the pandemic. So L prime CI is the country C sector I labor during the pandemic. So this is the on-site non-infected worker plus teleworkable people in that industry at home non-infected shift. Okay, so this is who are working, who are not sick. And output in country C in industry I is going to decline during the pandemic. So that's why hat, Y prime, output during the pandemic divided by before the pandemic, that's given by this Leontief assumption of taking the middle. Okay, so basically what we do is we map this equation to the data. For the second part of this equation, you see that we need all the intermediate, imported intermediate inputs, and of course the domestically used ones. Okay, so that's the supply and production side. For demand, we are also going to do it very simple. We are going to work with expenditure shares. I mean, the data is expenditure shares, right? That's what the global trade and production network data gives you. So we are going to basically completely use that to get at the demand profile, and we are going to make use of credit card data to get at spend. Okay, because data is expenditure shares, we are going to discipline that with spending data from credit card by sector. So we are going to use credit card data by sector. The pre-COVID, before COVID, obviously we are just going to use national accounts consumption data. And then the idea is your consumption by sector. Every sector consumption is going to switch between what you see in the national account before COVID and your credit card spending during COVID. And that's going to be a function of the infection rates, okay? So here we are just going to do the standard in these network papers, Cobb-Douglas utility function as a function of expenditure, every sector. And we use directly the expenditure data. Orange is what we use from data. Here, on the consumption side, this is Cobb-Douglas alpha I for every sector expenditure share parameter is going to be between 0 and 1. And we are just going to discipline it with the total expenditure in that sector. Now, how do we use the credit card data? So we are going to tell you that, okay, during the pandemic, so infection is going to be the proportion to the population, right? And this normalization is going to be when there are low cases versus high cases. So that's this fear factor, right? So the expenditure for every industry is going to change as a function of those infections, how you go high and low in the number of cases. And for the large infection, that's going to be the peak of the pandemic. That's going to be the lowest spending, right? Largest infection, lowest spending. So that's this orange line, the lowest EI bar, lowest spending expenditure in that sector. That's going to be pinned down with the credit card data. So the lowest spending in that sector at the peak of the pandemic. Okay, so that's how we are going to discipline the smooth demand function for every sector. Okay. And then the global part, right? How are we going to do that? That's just going to be very standard from this literature using Leontief inverses. So how we do this is first, M is going to stand for importer. So we are going to bring all these other countries in. So consumers in country M can domestically consume and they can consume imported goods into that industry. So we are going to denote those industry I goods coming from country C consumed by consumers in that as EMIC, okay? And that's basically going to be summed up over all the countries. So that means output of industry I in country C is going to be consumed as the final good is going to be given by the sum over M imports. And then during the pandemic, again, because demand drops in country M by that infection function, expenditure share in every sector I as a function of I to I bar, right? The I bar is the peak infection. So the final good consumption of industry of country C is going to change to F prime, okay? And that's basically when we do the output satisfying the final demand condition using Leontief inverse as standard in the literature. So that is going to give you the change in output. Again, denoted with Y hat. So F prime, remember the spending now including all the spending on also the foreign goods, imported goods. That's going to be the numerator is during the pandemic, and of course denominator is before the pandemic, and the equilibrium is going to be given by the minimum of supply and demand, these changes. Okay, and that's basically what we are going to feed to the data. Okay, so what is the data we are going to use? I already told you that we are going to use these country-specific infection rates. We used the original ones from Chakmakla and Şimşek, but now all these open sources give these rates to you. They are time varying, right? It used to be just we had like one thing, static, but obviously now we understand that this is something that varies a lot over time. So there are going to be these time varying infection rates, country-specific. We are going to use a recovery thing given by WHO. That will give you a gamma of 0.07. That means 14 days recovery. So basically, if a worker gets sick, goes home, 14 days, comes back to work. Okay, so that's going to be fully incorporated in the estimation. Remember, we are doing weekly estimations. So the basic reproduction rate for the country is going to be this time varying country level infection rate divided by the recovery rate, gamma. So each country, we are going to collect the beta C's, and gamma is 0.07 for each country. We don't change that. And endogenous lockdown is when ICU capacity reach. So that's going to be like a 14-day of lockdown. We also do that 14. So it is similar with the 14-day of recovery for a single individual. The lockdown, which means basically labor supply shock, is going to be at maximum. Also going to be 14 days. Infection rate goes to 0. You open up after that, infection rates then going to be slowly adjusting to the pre-lockdown level. Okay, and then if that is changing over time, that will be changing over time based on what is in the data. Now, remember, we do this all at the sector level. So to convert all those country level parameters to sector, we need these two pieces of data, teleworkable occupation. So how each sector teleworkable or not, that is going to come from Dingle and Nyman. And we also need a physical proximity. That comes from ONE. So these are completely different data sets, and teleworkable is literally going to be about the nature of the job. So it's going to be about literally a fisherman versus a university professor being able to do that job, teleworking or not. Whereas physical proximity is going to come from this question that people answer as basically it can be very close. I need to touch people to work, dentist versus I don't work near other people. Okay, so that's basically how we feed in the proximity requirement. Occupation level information is going to be converted to industry level. There are going to be several bridge files and mapping to do this. Now this became more standard in this literature. When we started, we had to do some of this ourselves. And of course, employment by sector comes from the OECD Trade and Employment Database. I see you stuff from WHO and John Hopkins, as I told you. Okay. Global trade and production network data is the OECD inter-country input tables. This again gives you the input usage of industry I in country C from any industry in any country. So it is what it is, right? These are the basic expenditure shares. So it is important to note here that these global input-output tables are a little bit different than the domestic ones, right? So when we go to the BEA US input-output tables, we think this as a structural relationship, right? Okay, car needs 4 tires, 4 glasses. Okay, this is a structural relationship that you need to produce that car. So that's a domestic IO table. A global IO table is going to obviously have exports and imports, right? So this is obviously there's a lot of endogeneity here, and the exercise is not about sorting that out. We literally use how much sector X in US imports, exports with sector Y in Brazil and Colombia. So we just use that data as is. So we are perfectly aware that that is going to combine the structural link, a car needing 4 tires and 4 windows, with how much steel being imported from Brazil, how much wood being imported from Canada to US, okay? So that is important because remember, we are going to have 2 scenarios where we don't let that to change. So we don't allow US construction sector shift from Brazil to China just because China is doing better and Brazil is doing bad. So we don't allow that. So that's going to be the most extreme scenario versus where we allow all those type of smoothings, which then of course going to be the least extreme scenario. So that's going to be basically doing some smoothing with us, but basically the data we use as is. And again, as I showed you in the figure before, this is 35 industries in 65 countries, global trade and production network data. Okay. Any questions so far before I go through the results on the setup? Because I don't see chat or any other questions.
Yeah. So thanks, Eminem. I don't see any questions from the audience, but maybe I've penciled a few on my own. So let me put them in. So for the SIR model, you have them at the sector level, right? But does this allow for infection cross sectors? So for instance, I could be infected by someone who works at the restaurants, even though I'm not myself. And my second question, so you have you have a model where people get infected, but nobody dies. And many things, many of these models are like that. But also what we saw is that a lot of the bad outcomes from COVID are from retired people. So in that sense, the working age people suffer relatively less. And is this something that would be important, or that would just be a refinement that wouldn't be worth the trouble?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So we don't let people die at all. So they are going to be sick and recovering in 2 weeks. The cross-sector and old people is there from this at-home group infection rate. So you are, if you may not directly affected, when you go to a restaurant, but you come home, and those teleworkable people come home at night. So that at-home group infection rate is going to be then spread out. So same with the old people, right? Old people don't go anywhere, but they're at home, and the person who goes on site affects those old people. Okay, so that kind of cross-contamination is there, but we don't let anybody die. So this means we can both be doing an under and overestimation here, but the cross things, because this at-home group is always going to be updated through whatever dynamic thing changing at the country level. We kind of distribute that to teleworking people, staying at home people, and on-site people. Okay.
Thank you. We don't have any further questions at this point, so go ahead.
Okay, great. So, so what do we do? Now, we want to understand these economic losses from different scenarios, right? I mean, so it can be very limited or it can be very high. This is going to depend on the channel of amplification, and it is going to be actually very fitting to what we examine in real life. And in real life right now, we have countries that is super recovering, right? Like countries like US, and there are some countries that are not there yet, like Europe. So I give you two rich country examples because there's also the policy which complicates our life a lot. So we don't have any policy here, right? So the policy, especially fiscal policy, is going to improve demand and is going to help a lot of the recovery. And then you have countries like US that does tremendous trillions. So that is definitely going to work against all that demand shock, right? Right now, when we have demand shock improving, that's going to be only because of vaccination. But of course, policy is going to add to that. So in that sense, we would like to give you different scenarios. Demand is improving, supply is improving different times. And these demand and supply improving different times, because that's also going to give you this whole bottleneck issue versus not, interacted with the amplification. Amplification is going to come through the IO network. You may be strongly attached to that IO network, or you may not. In fact, emerging markets are going to hurt more because they are more tied to that whole global supply chain than some rich countries. So we would like to kind of give you a spectrum, okay? So the key idea is still there is a health shock, okay? The shock is always going through this infection dynamic model, and we want to understand how much global and local amplification we can get from this health shock, which is going to affecting different countries and different sectors at different times that will affect demand and labor supply in a given country to IO, okay? So it is actually a complicated exercise because both the shock differs by sector, by country, and also given the demand and supply normalization will be differing based on the vaccine. So we only have that based on the vaccine in the paper, no fiscal monetary policy here. So that's going to give you even more heterogeneity. And on top of that, you are going to have this amplification through IO depending on your position, your country sector position in that network, okay? So we would like to, we do several things in the paper, but I would like to tell you two key things so that you can see kind of a very low number and a high number. We will say, okay, imagine there is no international production network. Okay, IPN is international production network. Regardless of that network, you will have because of COVID, you will have a demand shock, both domestic and foreign. We'll keep that in. You will have an intermediate input decline shock. No, you don't have that. I mean, you can have the domestic one, but you're not going to have the foreign one. Well, actually, no, sorry, you don't even have the domestic one because here we have no production network, whatever, no IO network, domestic or foreign. So you are not going to have that intermediate input shock. So the health shock being amplified is only because of your own domestic labors are being sick, okay? And also this demand, you are fearful to go to a restaurant. So a very domestic story. Then we are going to show you an IPN amplification, international production network. You still have the demand, domestic and foreign demand going down. So this is the same both scenarios. But now you have this intermediate input shock, linked to labor supply shock, and foreign demand shock, right? Both are going to give you that shock. And amplification is going to come depending on where you are on this inter-country, inter-industrial. Okay, so that's the COVID shock itself. Now, we further create heterogeneity by making heterogeneous vaccination, because the paper is about understanding the economic cost of unequal vaccination on rich countries. So this is, the table gives you the COVID shock heterogeneity. And then we say, look, vaccination is going to eliminate heterogeneously that labor supply shock and normalize demand in the countries that are vaccinated. Okay, that's how the vaccination works. So vaccination immediately gets rid of that epidemiology, everybody is now healthy. That means that labor supply shock is gone in that sector, in that country, and demand is fully back to pre-COVID expenditure. Okay, that's how the vaccination works in the paper. Okay, and we are going to, in terms of timing, remember we do weekly estimations, so timing matters. So we are going to work three scenarios. The first one is going to be, in advanced economies, there's immediate full vaccination. Okay, so January 2021, we start, everybody is fully vaccinated. Of course, this is not realistic, but we just, the point is to make how stark the difference can be. That's the first scenario. Emerging markets and developing economies, no vaccination, whatever. So literally, rich countries are vaccinated, poor countries are not. Lockdowns, no lockdowns. So let's say we are in a world, no lockdowns. So no lockdowns means labor supply shock is going to be a minimum only coming from the health shock, only in emerging markets and developing economies, okay? Because they are the ones with the health shock. In this scenario, advanced economies are fully vaccinated, they don't have a health shock. The intermediate scenario is we are going to assume the same in terms of vaccination. So the shock normalization is the same. Full vaccination in rich countries, no demand and labor supply shock anymore. No vaccination in emerging markets. Definitely there is a labor supply shock and demand shock. And labor supply shock is going to be worse because there's going to be endogenous lockdowns depending on that evolution of that disease. When cases are very high, we measure if they are bigger than the ICU capacity that we measure in data, then we are going to lock down for 2 weeks. So 2 weeks, there's going to be a very severe labor supply shock in that country and sector, okay? And last scenario, we try to get at a more realistic scenario, okay, full vaccination by mid-2021, okay? So in this scenario, in rich countries, rich countries are going to suffer from health shock in the first part of the year. So they are going to also have a labor supply shock and demand shock in their own economy. So in this scenario, they still have a restaurant problem, gym problem, and sick worker problem in this scenario, rich countries. In the first two scenarios, rich countries don't have that problem. And in the poor countries, emerging markets and the economies, we say, well, maybe no vaccination is obviously not realistic because vaccination started. So half vaccination by end of 2021. So 2022, they are going to full vaccination. Okay. Of course, now we know that none of this is going to be happening, but that's how we estimated at the beginning. And here in the paper, we do this last scenario, both with and without endogenous lockdowns. Here, I'm going to show you the endogenous lockdown. So under each scenario, under each these first group, second group, and third group, we are going to have this amplification, right? So the scenarios are for the COVID shock and normalization of the COVID shock that is going to work through demand and supply every sector country. And IPN, no IPN, IPN is how much that country-specific demand and supply shock at that sector is going to be amplified or not globally, okay? So no IPN, no international production network is zero amplification. So you are only going to be basically going through what is happening in your own country, and IPN is going to give you full-fledged trickling down through the global trade and production network. And if we just focus on the last scenario here, again, full vaccination in the rich countries by mid-2021 and half vaccination in poor countries by end 2021, and depending on the dynamic evolution of the infections, there are endogenous lockdowns in emerging markets and developing countries, what happens? Okay, so if there's no amplification, the world cost is going to be something around 2 trillion, around 400 billion for rich countries. So basically, emerging markets, of course, suffer way more. Most of the 2 trillion is emerging markets, 1.5 trillion. So 21% of the worldwide cost of this scenario is borne out by rich countries, okay? So not that high, but also not that low. I mean, this can be as low as 17%, in 17% share borne by advanced economies without any amplification in the first scenario, okay? Now, with amplification coming from global trade and production network, the cost goes to almost 4 trillion, and 49% of this, almost half of this global 4 trillion cost is borne out by rich countries. Why is that? Because in this scenario, there is all these global trade and production network story working. Rich countries like US construction sector is losing here. US wholesale and retail sector is losing here because, you know, either they cannot export enough or they cannot import things in time. By the way, this is never to say everything full stop, production full stop. The production doesn't stop, right? What we experience in real life is the delays. That's what we are trying to incorporate, right? Like those weekly delays. I mean, the things that you expect to receive in 3 weeks now becoming 3 months, okay? Because of the weekly estimation, we completely incorporate those delays, even though they might be smoothed out during the year, and that's what gives you the cost. But the cost can be very high because of those delays. And if you look at actually all these news items, that's exactly what global supply chain people argue about, that a lot of these costs either is being passed through customers through prices increase or written as a loss. And this is where these numbers are coming. Okay? And yeah, go ahead.
So may I jump in there? We have two questions from the floor. The first one by Ariel Levy, asking that in the model, all sectors see a declining curve of activity, but we've seen with the pandemic that some sector actually saw their business go up. We think of pharmaceutical or delivery services. So if we factor that in, what the changes would be. And the second question by Giuseppe de Archangelis, you have endogenous lockdown. Are these both in advanced and emerging economies, or in only one of the two groups?
Oh, so in the okay, let me answer that last question. In this last scenario, endogenous lockdown is also going to be in advanced economies. If it is until mid-2021, somehow there is any advanced economy that reaches its ICU, there will be an endogenous lockdown. We treat that symmetrically. But of course, it is half of the year, and you have to be a small country with a limited ICU capacity, a small rich country, to have that. So it's going to be limited, but we definitely allow that because it's completely work endogenously, right? Once you hit that ICU number, there is going to be a 2-week lockdown. So that's symmetric. On your first question, that's a very good question. Relative demand. So we didn't do that in the COVID shock. So like the fact that online delivery demand is increasing, pharmaceutical increase. So yeah, that's a very good question. We didn't do that. We did that in my other paper where we investigate the effect of COVID on firm failures. But here, it is going to be indirectly incorporated. There is going to be sectors with improving demand with these different timing of vaccine available, right? So it is going to be incorporated through demand normalization. But you are exactly right that the COVID shock itself, we don't say, oh, for certain sectors, this was the best thing ever happened to them. So we don't do that. I mean, that's a very good suggestion, actually. We should definitely do that. But we kind of incorporate that differences in demand through the vaccinations. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? No.
Not at this time, no.
Okay. So, again, this 21% of the global cost borne out by rich countries, if there is no amplification through network, versus half of the global cost borne out by rich countries, if there is amplification through trade, are these numbers small or big? So that's what is done in this bottom right corner relative to pre-pandemic GDP. So this is less than 1%. This 21%, of course, is less than 1% of rich world GDP before pandemic, but it is almost 3% of rich world GDP, again, pre-pandemic, 3% of pre-pandemic rich world GDP once we allow the amplification through international production. Okay. So this is just a heat map of this amplification. So there is no IO network, okay, globally. And you can see the distinction is purely becoming poor and rich. And so the orange red are the countries that lose more on GDP. Why? Because they had a worse pandemic. They don't have the vaccinations and they are having a bad time. That's the orange red. And yellow is the rich countries. They are having a better pandemic. I mean, here we only do this through vaccination, but of course, in the real life, it is going to be even more light yellow because they are going to have added dimension of spending a lot, fiscal policy packages being a lot. Now, the second figure, you see that now I have more oranges, dark yellows in the rich world because now I allow full amplification. Okay, and the numbers are the country-specific costs. Like, for example, in US, you can go from hundreds billion something to over 600 billion something, just allowing that supply bottlenecks into the estimation. Okay, all right. Just to make it clear how everything really comes from the sectoral estimation, and it's not just about being an open country or being a tradable sector. This figure is to communicate that message. So what I'm plotting here, I'm going to plot all one-digit sectors output change before after COVID, okay? And I'm going to show it as what if you're a fully vaccinated country, okay? That's on the left, fully vaccinated rich world. And on the right, I have fully unvaccinated emerging market and developing economies, okay? And the sectors are going to be color-coded, blue tradable sectors, pink non-tradable sectors. And these bars are, every dot is a country. So it shows you every sector's cross-country heterogeneity. So let me start with the unvaccinated poor world on the right to make the point. So this figure is very much a domestic figure. It is about domestic pandemic. Why? If you look at the sectors that are losing most, even there is cross-country heterogeneity, you see the accommodation and food service. Okay, that's a very typical message and figure you have seen so far many times. The figure on the right, unvaccinated countries, you know, the bottom, the highest sector, accommodation and food, the losses can be as much as 60% change, percentage point, before and after COVID. Arts, entertainment, recreation, right? So this can be as much as 60%, real estate, public versus. It's a very much like a domestic pandemic figure, okay? And these vertical black lines here are the maximum loss in that sector in a vaccinating country. For example, accommodation and food services, there are countries that are going to go as high as 60%, you know, average is going to be somewhere as 40% change. Whereas if you look at these vertical black line, a vaccinated rich country is less than 10% change loss in the accommodation and food service. Why? Because you are vaccinated, your restaurants are okay. Now, this doesn't mean these countries are not going to have any loss. I mean, that's the point of the paper. If you go to the left, vaccinated rich countries, if the sense is I vaccinate everyone in my country, I will open all the restaurants and gyms, everything back to normal, I am done. The point of our paper is to say, no, you are not, okay? And even you are not a very open country. If you think, oh, this is just because how tradable you are, we are going to say that, no, it isn't. There is a sectoral dimension and there is a tradability dimension. So, and to make that point, we exemplify two countries here, US with the blue diamond and Netherlands with the orange triangle. Why? Because Netherlands is a very more open country by any measure of openness than US. And you see that actually and they are both vaccinated. When they are both vaccinated, the losses in accommodation and food services, for example, arts and entertainment, like all these things, mining and quarrying, that is going to be affected from domestic pandemic. There is not that much a difference between US and Netherlands, and they're all doing well, like basically no loss, okay? Look at the sectors with big losses, right? For example, agriculture and fishing, it is a tradable sector, wholesale and retail, transportation and storage, non-tradable sectors. Now, Netherlands is going to have a much higher loss in a tradable sector than US, but US is actually going to have a higher loss than Netherlands in wholesale, retail, and transport and storage sector, because those sectors happen to be actually importing a lot of inputs from other countries in the US. Even US itself is another very open country, and these sectors are not trading sectors. The US, a fully vaccinated country, can have losses up to a change of more than 10% in those sectors because of the tight links of those sectors to other sectors that are importing a lot of inputs, or those sectors themselves also importing direct or indirectly inputs. Okay, so that's the point of fully embedding the sectoral heterogeneity together with the country heterogeneity in terms of the effect of global trade and production. Okay. I will say one more thing and I will stop. So we know that there are supply chain disruptions and they are getting better now. They are still around. I mean, at the beginning of the year, they were really bad, and the conjecture that they will go away by mid-year, they didn't go away. So there is this unfortunate puzzle that the trade is improving, right? So how can it be that agri trade is improving and we still have these supply chain disruptions if 2/3 of the agri trade is supply chain trade? Okay, so that's what we know the trade literature. I think this is a very interesting puzzle, and I am not a trade economist, but I think this is something very interesting for trade economists to look at. We look at that, and so far we think there are two reasons to explain that. First of all, trade is P times Q, prices times quantities, and price is going to have an effect there, differential effect, because different sectors are going to do different price adjustment because of different normalization in demand and supply. And the second is the inventory. Inventory management is also going to be different by sector, by country. And these combined can give you a booming trade at the same time as supply chain disruption, very, very severe supply chain disruption. Even supply chains are a big part of the agri trade. Just one figure here, it's Europe exports and imports. And you see that, I mean, this is by January actually. So it is giving you, so China is improving, US is improving, Europe is not that improving. It's going to be a lot of country level stuff here, again, depending on how you're improving, as opposed to looking at world trade. Euro area trade, again, this is by January, we update here, we still see a mixed message figure, although global trade is definitely, ergo trade, global trade is doing very well. But this is by January where Euro area trade is not doing that well. This is within themselves, panel A, with other countries in panel B. So this is a lot of updating the real-time data, and I think there are a lot still we don't know, especially when this is combined with the inventory data, inventory management, and the fact that this shock is very different than a regular shock. In a normal time recession, when trade goes down and trade goes up, we are dealing in a world where there's strong demand, inventories will go up, weak demand, inventories go down, and you have like these procyclical inventories, and you just they go back and forth with each other within this global trade and production network. So trade going down and up is going to be consistent maybe with the supply chain stuff. In a shock like COVID, and especially in an environment that shock affects sectors differentially, countries differentially at different times, and demand and supply normalize different times, you are going to have different behavior of inventories, right? Strong demand means inventory is going to go down, weak demand means inventory is going to go up. When we have to think about demand minus supply, if we only think about demand, it's very straightforward. But if we want to think about demand minus supply, and this thing is going to be negative for some countries, positive for others, and other different sectors, then it's a very complicated picture. So this is a figure again by February, how inventory is declining and suppliers delivery time index. Again, just adding to this thing that a supply chain disruption can go with improving trade in real time. And we did some regressions to make that point that COVID is really a shock that is affecting this demand minus supply, and inventories are going to be affected from that. So it is not that straightforward to just look at aggregate trade data and say, okay, we are out of the supply chain disruption. So we say, I think it's not going to be that straightforward during COVID, okay? But I'm out of time, so let me conclude and then answer other questions during Q&A. We demonstrated the economic case for global vaccinations on top of the moral case, which moral case is very clear. I think now, I hope economic case was clear. When we wrote this paper in January, we were actually the first paper and nobody was talking about the economic case. Everything was about morals and ethics. And we say, look, the economic case can be very serious. Global case can vary anything from 1 to 6 trillion, depending on the role of the IO, the sectors, countries' position in there. But advanced economies can bear from anything to 13 to 49% of these costs. So of course, I'm an optimist. We want to hope for the best, but we want to prepare for the worst, especially with a shock like this. I mean, it seems like, we are done with one version, then there is another Delta version. There can be now a Lambda Mu version. So it is a very uncertain environment. That is something very hard to evaluate with real-time data. Okay, and that's what the exercise is supposed to do. Let's try to make use of the data to the best sense we can to estimate some numbers that didn't happen maybe, but can happen in the future. The results rely on the fact that no economy is an island and connected to global trade and finance through complex international linkages. And the potential loss to advanced economies' GDP, even they vaccinate everyone, is larger than the investment needed in global vaccine initiatives. So when we wrote the paper, there was only COVAX. Now there are other initiatives, but we calculated a rate on return to investment in COVAX, and it's more than 100 times, right? COVAX basically need some billions, where the cost can be trillions. So investing in COVAX is basically best economic interest of advanced economy. So that's the point paper is trying to make. And given the extent of globalization, yes, globalization spread the pandemic. We have this situation because of globalization, but globalization is also the only solution to the pandemic. So the answer to this is not backlash against globalization and, let's just nationalize everything, close borders, because the point we are making is no economy is going to recover until every economy recovers. So we have to have a multilateral approach to solve the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shabnam. That was very interesting. Also, thanks for your responsiveness to questions. Also, thanks to the audience for the participation. So that closes the session for today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next GTDW seminar, which will be on October 4th with a presentation by Esteban Rossi-Ansberg. Okay. Thank you very much and have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.